Thank you, Mr. President. And I ask unanimous consent that Senator Shaheen and I be allowed to join into a colloquy concerning the 20th anniversary of the Srebrenica Massacre.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I am pleased to join my colleague from New Hampshire today to speak about a moving and important commemoration that she and I attended over the weekend. We were part of a U.S. delegation led by former President Bill Clinton that traveled to Bosnia and Herzegovina to remember the victims of the Srebrenica Massacre 20 years ago. We were honored to be joined in this delegation by Representative Peter King of New York, and also I think it's significant that former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright was part of this delegation. On July 11, 1995, more than 8,000 Bosniak Muslim men and boys were brutalized and murdered by Serbian forces who overran a United Nations safe haven during the Bosnian War. It was the worst massacre on European soil since the horrors of World War II. Today, Senator Shaheen and I wear green and white flowers on our lapels. These flowers were crocheted by Srebrenican mothers and widows in remembrance of the lives that were lost 20 years ago. The white is said to symbolize innocence, and the green represents hope. And it is said to be significant that the center is green because hope remains central to the country's future and to the region's future. Mr. President, 2 decades provide us with helpful benchmark for reflecting on the progress that has been made and on the progress that needs to be made. The decades have certainly not erased the deep scars left by the atrocities at Srebrenica, but the hurt continues to heal. International courts have recognized the massacre as a genocide, and a number of the perpetrators have been imprisoned. Peace is now present in the Western Balkans, and we need to do what we can to help maintain this peace. The Bosnia and Herzegovinian leadership is now applying for membership in the European Union. We wish them well on making the progress that will be necessary to attain this status. Tough decisions still need to be made by the leadership, by the tri-presidency of Bosnia and Herzegovina with regard to governance, corruption, and combating extremism. There's still way too much rhetoric that centers on ethnicity and continues to divide Bosnians rather than unite them. But we can celebrate the fact that this region is no longer home to the suffering and violence that predated the Dayton Accords, and we can celebrate the contribution and achievement of the Americans in reaching the Dayton Accords and in getting us to where we are now with 2 decades of peace. And I know these views are shared by my colleague from New Hampshire, and at this point, perhaps she would like to join in this colloquy.
Mr. President, I would like to join Senator Wicker from Mississippi in talking about what we saw and heard when we were in Bosnia. You know, unfortunately, the story that came out about that inspiring commemoration was about the attack by some of the Bosniaks who were attending on the Serbian Prime Minister, Aleksandar Vučić, who had attended the ceremony. But the larger story was one of reconciliation. And the Bosniak mayor of Srebrenica, Kamil Duraković, condemned the attackers, and he was joined by the tripartite presidents in condemning the attackers. And the Serbian prime minister, after the attack, said that it should not distract attention from the innocent victims of Srebrenica. He said that his arms of reconciliation remained stretched toward the Bosniaks, and fortunately, we heard the same thing from the mayor of Srebrenica, who actually had invited the prime minister. I'm very proud of Mayor Durakovic because he is actually a Bosnian American whose family fled from Srebrenica in July of 1995, and they settled in New Hampshire. He went to high school there, and he got a degree from Southern New Hampshire University. He returned to Srebrenica in 2005 and was elected mayor in 2012. And aside from that isolated, unfortunate incident with the prime minister, the ceremony was a solemn tribute and remembrance to the victims of Srebrenica. And there was a spirit of unity and harmony. The theme again and again was of reconciliation. And as my colleague points out, it's particularly important for us to continue to support this reconciliation, for us to continue to support Bosnia-Herzegovina in their efforts to continue to look west to join the EU, because across many centuries, the Balkans have been a flashpoint for conflicts that have spread to the rest of Europe and the entire world. In fact, 101 years ago next month, World War I began with the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand right in Sarajevo, a block. We walked by the block where he was assassinated. And as we've seen most recently in Greece, as we are seeing in the Balkans and in other countries in Eastern Europe, the Russians are quick to exploit any trouble in the southeast corner of Europe in order to spread their influence and destabilize the West. And wouldn't my colleague agree that it's important for us in the United States to join the EU in supporting the Bosniaks, the Serbs, the Croatians, the Muslims, the Orthodox Christians, the Roman Catholics, so that they can come together and show the world that we really can create a multi-ethnic, multi-sectarian state that can serve as a model for the Middle East and for countries around the world.
Mr. President, I do agree. And I would contrast the magnanimous statements of the tri-presidency and the gesture of the Serbian president in attending. I would contrast that with the disappointing actions of the Russian leadership under the leadership of President Putin in actually vetoing a Security Council resolution simply to commemorate the 20th anniversary as a genocide. Russia refused to accept a well-established fact confirmed by international courts, like the International Court of Justice, like the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. And they were the only vote against it, but it acted as a veto, thus keeping the United Nations officially from going on record as saying this was a genocide and that these acts should be condemned. Such defiance is a disservice not only to the victims at Srebrenica and to their memory, but also to relations in the area going forward. And I would just contrast that with the very brave step on the part of the Serbian president of coming to Srebrenica, being part of the commemorative ceremony. And I will tell my colleagues that former President Clinton spoke on behalf of this Republican and spoke on behalf of Democrats alike and I think making a very instructive and constructive address at the occasion, and specifically commending the Serbian president. I would say, with regard to the rock throwing incident, where the president of Serbia was actually hit and his glasses were broken, and he and members of his delegation were brought to their knees, I would say that if the 50 or so people that threw those rocks had heard the remarks inside of the ceremony, perhaps they would not have felt so bitter as to throw those rocks. I know there are wounds that need to be healed, But I think the conciliatory words inside that had been broadcast to the entire crowd would perhaps have caused that incident, which got all the publicity, not to happen. This was about 50 people causing a disturbance in a crowd, I would say, of around 5,000 people gathered outside for a very important ceremony, actually a funeral, you might say. And so I would have to say that the Russian leadership really should be ashamed of standing in the way of international recognition of this genocide. They thought they were doing their Serbian neighbors a favor, I suppose. But on the other hand, the Serbian president stepped forward in a very brave way to create unity in the region, and I think my colleague will agree with that.
Absolutely, and I know Senator Wicker shares my gratitude as we walked through the streets of Sarajevo and as we met people in Srebrenica, that I felt for the appreciation that they showed to the United States for our actions in helping to end that awful war in Bosnia and our actions in supporting Bosnia as they try and look westward, as they try and keep their country moving forward, address the corruption, the democracy issues that they face. But I think it's in our interest as Americans to support those efforts, to help them as they continue to move their country forward in every way that we can.
The senator from New Hampshire is exactly right. It is in the United States' interest that we care about the Balkans, that we care about Bosnia and Herzegovina. We owe it to the troops, the U.S. troops that were deployed there in 1995 and later, that kept the peace and made it work. There's no country on the face of the earth that could have done that except the United States of America. We owe it to the memory of the leadership, not only of President Clinton, who basically hosted the Dayton Accords in the United States of America, but also Republicans like Speaker Gingrich. It was Gingrich and Clinton who joined together and convinced this government to support the Dayton Agreement and to support the necessary deployment to make sure this worked. And then, as the senator pointed out, we owe it to history going forward to remember that World War I broke out in Sarajevo, that the events leading to World War II largely occurred in the Balkans, and to do what we can in the interest of the United States citizens to say that this will not again be a flashpoint for conflict in Europe and for conflict internationally.
And I know you share my belief that we also owe it to the victims of Srebrenica. And I look forward to continuing to work with you to do everything we can to support the efforts in Bosnia and Herzegovina.
And I too look forward to working on a bipartisan basis to make sure that this peace holds, to make sure that progress is made on the ethnic issues, that we give the Bosnian and Herzegovinians every reason to continue wanting to embrace Europe and to embrace the West and to embrace transparency and anti-corruption and all of the things it's going to take there. And so I appreciate the delegation. I appreciate Secretary Albright. I appreciate President Clinton leading the delegation. And I appreciate the indulgence of our fellow senators in hearing us with this colloquy. And with that, we yield the floor.